On October 15, 1917, at dawn in the Vincennes Castle, outside of Paris, a 41-year-old Dutch woman faced a 12-man firing squad of Moroccan soldiers. She declined the blindfold. She looked directly at the men who were about to kill her. She blew them a kiss. Her name was Margaretha Geertruida Zelle, though the world knew her as Mata Hari. She had been convicted of being a German spy by a French military court 3 months earlier in a closed trial where her lawyer was not permitted to cross-examine any of the prosecution's witnesses. She had maintained her innocence from the moment of her arrest in February 1917 through every interrogation, through every court session, through her imprisonment and her execution. 11 of the 12 bullets hit. In 1930, 13 years after her death, the German government publicly exculpated her. They stated formally that she had not been a German spy. France did not respond. In 2017, France released previously classified documents related to the case. Historians who examined them concluded that Mata Hari had almost certainly been a scapegoat, a convenient figure to blame for French military failures during the most catastrophic year of a war that was killing French soldiers at a rate the government could not publicly acknowledge and could not explain without admitting strategic and tactical failures that extended all the way to the political leadership. The legend of Mata Hari, the seductive femme fatale who danced her way through military secrets and delivered them to the enemy, was constructed largely after her death. The woman who was actually executed at Vincennes Castle was something considerably more complicated, considerably less glamorous, and, in the view of most historians who have examined the actual evidence, almost certainly not guilty of the crime she died for. This is the history they left out of every film. Margaretha Geertruida Zelle was born on August 7, 1886, in Leeuwarden, in the Netherlands. Her father was a hat merchant who went bankrupt when she was a child. Her mother died when she was 15. She was sent to live with her godfather, then briefly to a teacher training school where the headmaster developed an inappropriate interest in her, and she was removed by her family. At 18, she answered a newspaper advertisement placed by a Dutch colonial army officer named Rudolf MacLeod, who was looking for a wife. She had never met him. They married. He was 21 years older than her, had syphilis, and was by multiple accounts a brutal and unfaithful husband. Together they moved to the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia, where MacLeod was stationed. They had 2 children there. Their son Norman died as a toddler. The most probable cause, which several historians have documented, was that MacLeod had infected the boy with syphilis through his nurse. Their daughter, Jean Louise, whom everyone called Non, survived. The marriage deteriorated into what the historical record describes as mutual recrimination, mutual infidelity, and documented physical abuse on MacLeod's part. They separated and divorced after returning to Europe. MacLeod retained custody of Non by the simple expedient of stopping the financial support that would have allowed Margaretha to feed them both. She arrived in Paris in 1905, alone, nearly broke, and with skills she could convert into income that were limited to languages, writing, and whatever social graces a childhood in provincial Netherlands had given her. What she built from those materials was one of the most remarkable acts of self-invention in early 20th century Europe. She invented an origin story. She claimed to be half Indian, raised in a sacred temple by Brahmin priests, trained in the ritual dances of the Far East. She invented a name, Mata Hari, which means Eye of the Dawn in Malay. She invented a performance that mixed genuine understanding of Indian and Indonesian dance traditions she had absorbed in the Dutch East Indies, with the erotic staging that Parisian audiences in 1905 found simultaneously exotic and transgressive. She was, by her own later admission to a friend, not actually a very good dancer. What she was extraordinarily good at was performing the idea of mystery in a way that a specific social moment was primed to consume. Pre-war Paris was fascinated by the Orient, by the exotic, by the transgression of social boundaries that a wealthy cosmopolitan audience could experience at a theater without any personal risk. Mata Hari gave them exactly what they wanted and charged accordingly. The performances toured Europe. She became genuinely famous, not as a spy, but as a performer and courtesan. The two roles overlapping sufficiently in the social world she inhabited that they became parts of the same persona. Her lovers included senior military officers, diplomats, and aristocrats from multiple countries. She charged for the company. The information that passed between people in the social world she moved through was the normal currency of that world. Gossip, rumor, the kind of general knowledge that any attentive person in proximity to powerful men could accumulate. The social world that Mata Hari inhabited in pre-war Europe deserves more specific attention than the mythology of the seductive spy usually allows. Because understanding that world clarifies why the accusation of espionage was simultaneously so easy to make against her and so difficult to disprove. The European aristocratic and military officer class of 1905-1914 was a small, interconnected social network in which a relatively limited number of wealthy families moved between the same cities, the same hotels, the same resorts, and the same theaters. A courtesan who performed in Paris, Berlin, Vienna, and Madrid was not accessing secrets through seduction so much as moving through a social world where information circulated as normal social currency among people who happened to hold military and political offices. The dinners, the salons, the private parties where Mata Hari was present were the same dinners, salons, and parties where senior officers discussed the war, because there was no social environment in which they did not discuss it. This means that the accusation that she gathered intelligence through her relationships with officers was simultaneously true and meaningless as a description of deliberate espionage. Of course, she knew things military officers knew. Every person in proximity to military officers in 1916 Paris knew things military officers knew. The question that the prosecution at her trial consistently refused to engage with precisely was, did she transmit any of that information to Germany in a form that produced operational damage? And the answer, documented in sources from both German and French archives, was apparently not. When the war started in 1914, Mata Hari was caught in a complicated position that the later espionage mythology consistently oversimplifies. She had lovers and professional contacts on both sides of the conflict. She was Dutch, which meant neutral, which meant she could cross borders that combatant nationals could not. She needed money continuously. The performance career that had made her famous in 1905 had faded by 1914. The world was different, and the income from her relationships with wealthy men was increasingly uncertain. In late 1915, according to the account she gave under interrogation, a German consul in the Netherlands offered her 20,000 francs in exchange for whatever information she could provide on her next trip to France. She took the money. She gave him, by her own account, and by the assessment of German intelligence documents that were later examined, nothing of military value. She had been assigned the code name H-21 by the Germans, but there is no documented evidence that she ever transmitted anything of substance. She believed the money was partial compensation for the furs and bank accounts the Germans had seized from her in 1914 when they occupied the areas where her assets were held. The figure of Captain Georges Ledoux deserves more examination than Mata Hari's story usually provides, because his role in the case is considerably more complicated than the straightforward narrative of a French intelligence officer identifying a genuine enemy agent. Ledoux had built his career on a particular approach to counterintelligence that involved extensive use of double agents, planted information, and elaborate deception operations. He was sophisticated, ambitious, and operating in an environment where the normal rules of evidence and proof were suspended by wartime emergency powers. He was also, as his own subsequent arrest revealed, someone whose loyalties were sufficiently ambiguous that his own service suspected him of working for the enemy. When Mata Hari approached him in 1916 and offered to spy for France, Ledoux was in the position of a counterintelligence officer who might have used her as a genuine asset, might have used her as bait to draw out German operations, or might have been simultaneously managing her as one element of a complex operation with goals she was never told about. The documentation of what Ledoux actually believed and intended has never been fully declassified, and some of it was apparently destroyed during the war. What is documented is that he recruited her, gave her a mission in German-occupied Belgium that he either knew she could not accomplish or that he designed to fail, and then arrested her on the evidence of German radio messages that French intelligence should have known, given their familiarity with German code-breaking capabilities, were exactly the kind of messages the Germans would send in a broken cipher when they wanted France to act on them. Whether Ledoux was incompetent, malicious, or himself being manipulated by layers of intelligence operations that even he did not fully understand, the outcome was the same. A woman he had recruited died, and he faced no equivalent consequence. Subscribe to Operatives Untold right now, because what happened next is a masterclass in how intelligence services can construct a case against someone who may be entirely innocent, and how a military court system without meaningful procedural protections can ratify that construction as a death sentence. In 1916, looking for income, Mata Hari approached French intelligence and offered to spy for France. She met with Captain Georges Ledoux of the Second Bureau, the French Military Intelligence Service. She proposed working as a French agent in exchange for payment. Ledoux agreed, at least in principle. What neither Mata Hari nor Ledoux fully understood was that both of them were operating inside a German intelligence operation. German counterintelligence was aware that the Allies had broken the specific cipher they were using for certain communications. They deliberately sent radio messages in that broken cipher, knowing the Allies would read them, that mentioned Mata Hari as Agent H-21, their own agent, even though she was not functioning as their agent in any meaningful sense. The goal was to burn her as a French asset, sow confusion in Allied intelligence, and, potentially, expose other French intelligence operations through the investigation that would follow. The Germans were manipulating both Mata Hari and the French intelligence apparatus simultaneously, and it worked. The intercepted radio messages identifying her as Agent H-21 became the primary evidence at her trial. The prosecution presented them as proof that she was an active German spy. What the prosecution did not acknowledge was that German counterintelligence had sent those messages in a cipher they knew France had broken, which meant the messages were designed to be read by France, which meant they were at minimum as much an intelligence operation as they were genuine German communications about a genuine German agent. Her trial, held in July 1917 before a closed military court, lasted 2 days. Her lawyer, Edouard Clunet, was 74 years old and had no experience in military law. Under the rules of the military tribunal, he was not permitted to cross-examine any of the prosecution's witnesses. He was not permitted to cross-examine his own witnesses. He could present evidence and make arguments, but the procedural constraints that any modern legal system would consider fundamental to a fair trial were simply absent from the proceedings. She was accused of causing the deaths of 50,000 French soldiers through the intelligence she had passed to Germany. The prosecution offered no evidence of how any specific military operation had been compromised by any specific piece of information she had transmitted. The claim was made as assertion and repeated as conclusion. She was found guilty. She was sentenced to death. Mata Hari spent the months between conviction and execution in the Saint-Lazare prison in Paris. She had multiple visitors, including the officers who had been her lovers and who came now carefully and with discretion to say goodbye or to express regret. She continued to maintain her innocence. She wrote letters. She managed, even in prison, to project something of the carefully constructed persona she had spent her adult life building. On the morning of October 15, 1917, she was dressed, given a glass of rum, and escorted to the execution site. She kissed her lawyer and the nun who had stayed with her. She declined the blindfold. She declined to be tied to the post. She looked at the soldiers who were about to shoot her, and she blew them a kiss. The cultural afterlife of Mata Hari is as revealing about the society that consumed it as it is about the woman at the center of it. Between her execution in 1917 and the 1930s, she appeared as the central character in at least 5 major films. Greta Garbo played her in a 1931 Hollywood production. Marlene Dietrich played a character transparently based on her in Joseph von Sternberg's Dishonored the same year. The two most iconic actresses of early Hollywood cinema, representing the two dominant models of female sexual fascination that the industry had developed. Both played variants of the same woman in the same year, which tells you something about how central the Mata Hari myth had become to early cinema's understanding of female danger. What all these films shared was the same foundational premise: a beautiful woman using sex as a weapon to extract military secrets, a figure whose danger lay specifically in her femininity, deployed as deception. The premise was enormously popular because it served several simultaneous cultural functions. It explained military failure through external betrayal rather than internal incompetence. It reinforced anxieties about female sexuality and mobility in a period when women's roles were visibly changing. And it provided a narrative framework in which female intelligence and female sexuality were presented as inherently threatening rather than inherently valuable. The real Mata Hari, the bankrupt hat merchant's daughter from Leeuwarden, who invented herself out of necessity, who built a career from nothing in a city where she knew no one, who accepted money from a German consul and gave nothing of substance in return, who was caught in the middle of an intelligence operation she had no idea was happening, and who died at dawn in a castle courtyard because a military court without meaningful procedural protections decided she was guilty, was considerably less useful for those cultural functions than the legend. The historical record does not resolve with certainty what Mata Hari actually did or did not do. The weight of evidence, as examined by historians including Pat Shipman, Russell Warren Howe, and the researchers who analyzed the 2017 French document release, suggests that she was not the master double agent of the legend, that she probably accepted money from Germany and gave nothing of substance in return, that her work for French intelligence was more wishful than operational, and that she was caught in the middle of a German intelligence operation, designed to burn her while she had no idea it was happening. The German government's 1930 public exculpation said clearly that she had not been their agent in any meaningful sense. The 2017 French document release, according to historians who examined it, supported the scapegoat theory that French intelligence needed a conviction to justify its own operational failures, and that Mata Hari, a foreign woman of dissolute reputation, who had admitted taking German money and who had made herself impossible to defend in the court of respectable opinion by how she had lived, was the most convenient available candidate. Captain Ledoux, the French intelligence officer who recruited her and who was the central architect of the case against her, was himself arrested and charged with double espionage in 1917, the same year she was executed. France kept that fact classified for a century. It was declassified in 2017. The man who built the case that sent Mata Hari to the firing squad was himself suspected of being the thing he accused her of being. France executed her in October. It arrested him 2 months later. His case was dropped. He eventually retired with his reputation intact. Mata Hari's name has meant the seductive female spy ever since the execution that made her famous in death in ways she had never quite achieved in life. The performance she had constructed in 1905, the mysterious Eastern dancer with an invented origin story, became the template for a century's worth of fictional female spies, all of whom shared the same basic premise: a beautiful woman using intimacy to extract secrets. That premise was useful to intelligence agencies, to governments at war that needed to explain failures without examining their own failures, and to a cultural imagination that found it easier to believe that military disasters could be caused by a seductive foreigner than that they were caused by the decisions of military leaders who remained in their positions and faced no consequences for the casualties those decisions produced. Whether Mata Hari was entirely innocent is genuinely uncertain. Whether she was guilty of what she was executed for is on the basis of the available evidence and the historical consensus of the past several decades? Almost certainly not. She declined the blindfold, blew a kiss, and died for a crime that most historians now believe she did not commit, while the man who built the case against her was suspected of the same crime 2 months later and faced no equivalent consequence. That asymmetry is not a footnote in the history of World War I. It is the history of World War I, seen from the angle the official record preferred not to examine. If you want the history behind the operations they don't make movies about, subscribe to Operatives Untold, because next week we go somewhere even more dangerous.